Great pleasure. I welcome you here tonight in this West India house. This very historical building was the former head office of the West India Company, and as you know, the cradle of New York, and also the John Adams Institute base, and we're quite proud of that. My name is Monique Knapen, and as director of the John Adams Institute, I'm very proud Michael Chabon is here tonight and opening our lecture season. Last year, September, Wally Lamb was here and opened our series, and he tipped us on Michael. And he said he was, being the hottest author in the States, and at that time, not a Pulitzer Prize winner yet. And so my predecessor, Anne Wertheim, she was quick as ever, and immediately invited Michael Chabon. And a year later, he's here. So I'm very happy with that. In a moment, I will ask Peter Steinz to introduce our guest, Michael Chabon, in more detail. But before I do that, I would like to thank publisher house Ambo Antos, who made a beautiful translation, I think, in Dutch. And I really enjoyed working with you. The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier Clay. It's also a book that Nielsen and Lamb, the book importers, brought us here. So I also would like to thank them for their participation for tonight. There will be no intermission tonight, and after Peter Stein's introduction, which will be short, about 8 minutes or so, we'll ask 8 or 7. We will ask Michael to come up and have a talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and he will do some book readings, he told me, so I think you will enjoy that. And after his talk, Peter Steinz will come up again, and he'll have a public interview here on stage. And after a certain time, he will ask you to involve and ask questions if you like. We try to close the evening at 9:30, 9:40. We're a little late already, so we try to do that because people have to catch trains and get back. But Michael will also be assigning books later on in the hall near the bar, which will be open after the lecture. For now, please switch off your mobile phones and refrain from smoking. And I would like Peter Steinz to come up here and start with the program. Thank you so much.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this evening with Michael Chabon, the Superman, or should we say the boy wonder of modern American literature. At the age, he's 37, when other people are still deciding what they want to be, he has written 3 novels and 2 collections of short stories. And for The Adventures of Kavalier Clay, he won the Pulitzer Prize. And so he has proven one of the important one-liners from his novel: there is no force more powerful than an unbridled imagination. Michael Chabon was born in 1963 in Washington, D.C. He grew up in Maryland, among other states, and studied in Pittsburgh, the city that is the setting of his 2 first novels. He wrote a thesis for his study creative writing, which was immediately published in 1988, and then became part of the Brat Pack in American literature, the young writers who came up in the 80s. His novel was called The Mysteries of Pittsburgh. It was a coming-of-age novel, and a huge success, critically and commercially. And then, of course, there's always the difficult second novel. A whole story in the case of Michael. More than 5 years, he slaved on a novel which amounted to 1,500 manuscript pages. In an interview I had with him about 5 years ago, he said, "I wanted too much. In my new novel, all my favorite subjects had to come together, from baseball to architecture to the restaurants of Paris. In retrospect, I see myself as a beginning cook who had a lot of success with a relatively simple dish, but who wanted to follow that up with something much more complicated. I ended up desperately among the heaps of flour and the dirty pans, or rather, I left everything too long in the oven. End of quote. But Michael Chabon escaped from this mess, like a literary Houdini. He discarded the Millstone manuscript and wrote Wonder Boys, a campus novel about, among other things, a writer who gets stuck in a Millstone manuscript. After that, it was success. The book was successful. A film was being made with Michael Douglas as the protagonist, and a film which got Bob Dylan his first and probably only Oscar. This was all part of the fat years of Michael Chabon's career, which still go on, we hope it will be going on, and which has also resulted in the adventures of Kavalier and Clay. About the adventures of Kavalier and Clay, it's a story in more levels. On one level, it is a story of the friendship and the rivalry of two cousins, one from Prague, one from New York, who make it big as comic strip writers, and they are the Kavalier and Clay from the title. On a second level, it is a historical novel about the golden age of comics, New York City in the 30s and the 40s, the heyday of what Chabon calls the long underwear hero trade. And then on a third level, it's a novel about escapism. It is a novel about a Jewish boy, a magician, one who studies to be a magician, who escapes from Hitler's Europe to the New World in order to make comics about a superhero called the Escapist, who fights Hitler and of course wins. And finally, though not really finally, because this is a big and incredibly rich book, it is a book which explains how Roy Lichtenstein got the idea to blow up cartoons, how Salvador Dali was saved from suffocation at a surrealist party in which he wore a helmet, and how Orson Welles was influenced by a comic strip about a hero in long underwear. To stick to Chabon's own metaphors, he has proved himself to be a master cook, or rather a super magician. The Adventures of Kavalier and Clay was very well reviewed and got, again, there we go again, the Pulitzer Prize this year. Probably because it was a moving story as well as a great American novel. Because it was written in prose that is humorous as well as very beautiful. And I leave it to Michael Chabon to illustrate this in the next 40 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you all for coming. Wow. I'm surprised to see so many people here, and I'm very gratified, so thank you very much. Is there some water up here somewhere? Oh, thank you. I apologize, I've been talking all day long about an extremely tedious subject myself, and so my throat is a little dry, but I think it's probably appropriate that I'm here this evening at the West Indies house, which, as Monique mentioned, is at least, thank you very much, in some way, the source of the city of New York, which is the subject of my novel, because I'm going to be talking about sources this evening, or the source in many ways of this novel, The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay. The book is dedicated to my father. but it would probably be more appropriate if it said something like "of my father" or "from my father," because it was really my father who made the writing of this book possible in a number of different ways, and I'd like to talk about that this evening. And hopefully some of you have fathers and will be able to sympathize with what I'm saying. There was an American science fiction writer named Philip Jose Farmer. I don't know if his work is known in Holland or not, but he once devised the conceit that he was writing a biography of Tarzan. He was trying to write a serious biography of the character of Tarzan, Lord Greystoke, to give him his proper title. And as a kind of an appendix to this biography, he concocted this wild theory that an ancestor of Tarzan, of Lord Greystoke, was among the passengers of two coaches that were traveling through a part of England called Wold Newton. It's a small town in England. On a day in 1795, when a meteorite fell from the sky and landed in Wold Newton, a radioactive meteorite. And that is actually, that part of this, what I'm about to say to you, is apparently based on fact. There really was a meteorite that fell from the sky in Wold Newton in 1795. But what Mr. Farmer postulated was that the radiation from this space rock caused a genetic mutation in the genes of all the people that were riding in those two carriages. And it was from those people that eventually John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, better known as Tarzan, was descended. And that not only was Tarzan descended from those people riding in those carriages, but all of the heroes and villains of 19th and 20th century popular fiction, the Scarlet Pimpernel, Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty, Phileas Fogg, Fu Manchu, Sam Spade, James Bond, all of them were descended from the people riding in that pair of coaches. So it's a kind of a superhuman lineage. Now, when I was about 9 or 10 when I encountered this astonishing hypothesis in Farmer's biography of Tarzan, it came as no surprise to me at all, because my father had already come to a very similar kind of conclusion about us. Excuse me, I'm just gonna, this is what I call my Al Gore move. Over the years, my father has informed me, and he seems, pretty serious about it when he does this, and he doesn't really give any explanation about why he has never mentioned this before now. But over the years, he's informed me that we Chabons are connected, distantly perhaps, to the following people: the great tragedienne Rachel, the French actress famous for performing Racine and Corneille, a Jewish actress, the humorist Art Buchwald, the vicious murderer Lepke Buchhalter, who's better known as one of the members of Murder, Inc., Rabbi Eliyahu, known as the Gaon or genius of Vilna, Harry Houdini, the first-class spy and third-rate baseball player Mo Berg, and most gloriously of all to Napoleon Bonaparte. And it's apparently he left no direct descendants. We're well aware of that, but it's an indirect, the illegitimate union between his nephew, Napoleon III, and Rachel, the French tragedienne. And supposedly their illegitimate offspring was one of my ancestors. Now, the question of whether my father is telling the truth when he comes up with this stuff, I'm not sure how interesting a question it really is. I think he believes it. He seems to believe it. And, what he says could be true. And that's good enough for me. It's good enough for me as a reader, so it's good enough for me as a son. I think the importance to me of my father's stories when I was growing up was one that they were so detailed and peculiar. I mean, it wasn't like well, Napoleon, okay, he's pretty famous, but a lot of the other people were so obscure, and even that he even knew who they were seemed to offer itself as a kind of evidence that we must be related to him, or else why would he ever heard of Rachel, for example, who's sadly not as well known as she once was. And secondly, the sense of connectedness that I got from hearing these stories, the feeling that when he wouldn't just tell me about that we were related. He would then give me sort of a précis of the person's career and history, and all of these people scattered across all these different continents and times, that I was in some way connected to all of them. It gives you a strange sense of simultaneity, I think, when you're a little kid, as though you were sort of existing in all these different places at all these different times. It was right after, when I was 10 years old, right after I read Philip Jose Farmer's biography of Tarzan, that I produced my first story, and I think there's probably a connection. It was a short story, about 12 pages long, called The Revenge of Captain Nemo. And it was about a meeting between Captain Nemo, who, according to Philip Jose Farmer, was also descended from those people riding in those carriages, and Sherlock Holmes. I don't think it was a very good story. If it were good, I would, have brought it with me, and I would quote it right now to prove to you what a brilliant child I was. But it got off to a pretty leisurely start, somewhat like this talk I'm giving now, and then kind of meandered along for 10 pages at a very leisurely pace, and then suddenly I realized I was 12 pages into my story and I had everything explode. So it ended with a big explosion that sort of wrapped everything up really quickly. But two things happened to me while I was writing it. And the first was that for the very first time as a writer, if I can call myself at age 10 a writer, I adopted a style, a literary style. It was the style of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or of Dr. John Watson, if you prefer. I've always been sensitive to, I think, to diction, to writer's diction, to the differences, how you could tell that you were writing something that had been written by an American versus something that had been written by a British writer, from the different words that they used. The difference between jocular language and hard-boiled language, the difference between words of Latin origin and words of Anglo-Saxon origin. All of that stuff was part of my understanding of language, and I think that made it possible for me to hear Doyle's voice very clearly. I mean, it's a very clear voice. It's a very beautiful style in its own way, a very plain kind of vigorous, solid, good British kind of style. And it was as if it were a tune that I could hear in my head, and what I needed to do was just sit down and play it. That was amazingly fun to do, as it turned out, and I wasn't expecting that. I tried to use words like postulated and retribution, and I said things like had the odor of instead of smelled. And I talked about the railway schedules and Paddington Station and so on. I called Moriarty the Napoleon of crime, which then linked him to my family tree, at least in my own imagination. And when I was finished and I showed it to my parents, it went over pretty well. And my parents praised me, and so did some other adults that I knew. I was very proud of myself. First of all, I had typed the whole thing myself. And typewriter was certainly a formidable machine. And I almost, killed myself just typing it. But even more precious to me was just that the pleasure that I had gotten from trying to imitate Arthur Conan Doyle, from just sort of putting his accent on. And what I felt as I was writing that story, as I was putting on the voice of Arthur Conan Doyle, was connected to him. intimately. Not as if somehow I were putting his skin on, but in a weird way as if he were putting on mine. Like something you could imagine in a ghost story where you sit down, someone sits down to play the piano and feels another hand sort of, making the fingers touch certain keys and not others. It was like suddenly I stepped into a room where all the writers that I admired at the time, and at that point, at age 10, it was kind of an odd bunch, from Judy Blume to Edgar Allan Poe. Some of them seemed to have more in common with others, like Lord Dunsany and H.P. Lovecraft, and others had no apparent connection at all, but somehow they all felt connected to me, as though they were in some way my family. I was in some way the product of what I had read, and this exercise of imitating Conan Doyle had kind of proven that to me. Now, so this really is, in a sense, the first thing I think that I owe, and that this book owes to my father, is just this strange model of genealogy as a kind of way of feeling connected to people to whom actually you have no connection whatsoever. The second thing is the question of plausibility and the detail. This is something that my father was an expert at. He remains to this day, I should say. It's been a while since he's come up with a new one, but I think he knows I'm on to him. But if you needed to explain how Rochelle was traveling incognito in a carriage in Switzerland, and every so often she would stop at a small village, and another carriage would pull up, and it had Louis Napoleon in it, and they would get together in an inn, and so on. I mean, God knows where he got all that, but perhaps it's true. The details were important, and I think his use of detail, of peculiar detail, was very instructive to me. And, at times I think I even get accused by some critics of being a little overly fond of detail. More directly, a conversation began between my father and me when I was about 5 years old, and the subject of that conversation was his childhood. My father was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1938, and lived there until 1954 when his family moved to Washington, D.C., which is where I was born. And I don't know how many of you are possibly from Brooklyn, the American Brooklyn, I mean, or how many of you know people from Brooklyn, but if you are from Brooklyn, and from this era that I'm talking about, or if you know someone who is, then you probably know that people who are from Brooklyn at that period like to talk about Brooklyn. It was a kind of a golden period in many ways for Brooklyn, probably the peak of Brooklyn's existence as a place with a sense of itself. The Brooklyn Dodgers baseball team was not that great yet, but they were at least getting better. Their era of greatness was sort of yet to come still. Brooklyn was a part of New York City, but it was still very much had its own identity as a separate place. It does still to this day. But I don't know, there's something that seems especially tinged with gold about the reminiscences of people who grew up in Brooklyn at this time. And the way this all began for me and my father was that he brought a record home from the library. I still remember it very well, and it was a record called Themes Like Old Times. And it was a collection of the theme music from classic radio programs of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Mostly the 30s. And that's it. And he sort of just handed it to me and said, here you go, listen to this. And I put it on, and I was entranced. First of all, by the whole idea of radio programs, because by the time I'm talking about, which is, say, 1968, there weren't any radio programs anymore. Radio was just music or news. But the idea that there had been these dramas, comedies, adventures, anthologies of short stories and so on the radio, and that people had listened to the radio, and that there were these themes and characters. And as my father began to talk we were listening to the record, and as he began to talk, it was all coming back to him, in a rush, and he could remember entire plot lines, and that fascinated me. And it really began the conversation about his childhood, in which I began to press him for more and more details about things that he could remember. And one of the things that had been most important to him growing up, along with radio programs, the Brooklyn Dodgers, and the great movie serials of the time, I guess I don't know what they would be called here, feuilleton is another name for them, but these movie serials in 25 parts that were show every Saturday. You'd see another part, and they were about the Lone Ranger and Superman and Flash Gordon and so on. Another important thing to him in his childhood had been comic books. And I was just starting to read at this age, and so very shortly after this record came home, the first comic book came home. And it so happens that this period, when I began reading comic books, which a period that began in the late 60s and lasted toward the end of the 70s for me, at this very initial period, DC Comics, the home of Superman and Batman and the Flash, the Green Lantern, Hawkman, and so on, Wonder Woman, they were for some reasons having to do with the economics of printing, which I don't quite understand. They decided it was more profitable to print thicker comics with more pages and charge less for them. Maybe some publishers in the audience could explain that to me sometime, but I'm sure it had to do with the scale of paper orders or something. But because they had these big comic books to fill and only so much new material with which to fill them, they began to pad them with reprint material. And the reprint material, the material that they chose to fill out the backs of these comic books, was overwhelmingly the same comic books that my father had read as a kid. It was the stuff from the 40s and 50s. The stuff my father had grown up on was now being offered to me by the very same company at I guess, twice the price. And so I got to read exactly what my father had read. It wasn't like the radio thing where I could listen to that tantalizing record, but the actual programs were unavailable to me. This would not be true for a child of today, where you can find a lot of these radio programs now on the World Wide Web, but at that point, there was no way for me to listen to those radio programs. But here were the comic books. Here they were. They were printed. They were reprinted directly photographically. They actually photographed the old comic books, and then that was how they made the reproduction. So there was a kind of murky, blurry, dark quality to them that I was later surprised to see the originals didn't have at all. That I was then forever after associated sort of with that time, and my father's childhood therefore took on a kind of murky, dark quality, which if you knew his mother, you would probably understand. I knew, and I think this made it more valuable to me as well, that my father had been introduced to comic books by his father, who was a printer in a plant on the west side of New York where they printed comic books. Although, it's hard to get a straight answer out of my father on the subject of whether my grandfather actually printed comic books. I think if you asked him today, he would probably say yes, of course he did, but actually I think it was movie posters that he printed. But he brought comic books home by the bagful for my father. And I knew that, and I was aware that there was this chain, this continuity of childhood that seemed to be extending from me back to my father and then to his father, and it was a real continuum in that I was actually consuming the same comics that my father had consumed. This fascination with comic books, with the period of my father's childhood, continued for the rest of my life. And I never lost my interest in the history of the Second World War, the big band music of the time, the social history, the Roosevelt administration, the Truman administration. All of that's always been fascinating to me, and it's clearly because I was introduced to it with this tantalizing record at the age of 5. That was sort of the culture medium out of which this novel grew. It was triggered by I think, more directly, a sense of dissatisfaction that I was feeling with my work. After rescuing myself from the culinary disaster that Pieter alluded to, by writing Wonder Boys, I was confronted with the fact that what I had finally whipped up was sort of light and tasty, but maybe not especially nourishing, and half an hour later you'd be hungry again. And I had the same urge, although I was a little more wary about it now than I had been the first time, to try something more ambitious. And in trying to think about where that dissatisfaction comes from, partly I could attribute it to myself, partly to a review that the book critic Jonathan Yardley of the Washington Post wrote, in which he praised Wonder Boys very kindly, but concluded his review by saying, okay, you've now done 2 novels written in the first person, both set in Pittsburgh, both take place in a very limited time, they have very limited point of view. Let's really see what you can do. I don't think Jonathan Yardley realized that my father had said something very much like that to me about two days before the review appeared. And ultimately, I think that is the true source of the dissatisfaction. Is my father always believed in me, and has always believed in me as a writer. He always encouraged me. He always took it completely at face value when I said I wanted to be a writer and I was 10 years old writing this bad Sherlock Holmes story. He never, ever tried to discourage me. And in fact, on the contrary, I think he was waiting for me to write something that he had a certain expectation of the kind of book that I was going to write. And I just had not written it yet. This book, in many ways, is my attempt to write that book. And I was very gratified, when I did give it to him, that when he read it, he seemed to approve. I'm just going to close. I'm going to say a little bit more, and then I'm just going to read very briefly. But I think one of the things that emerged as a motif in this novel that came as a surprise to me was the figure of the Golem of Prague, the artificial man created by a rabbi for various purposes. All the stories are different, but some say just to be a manservant or to clean up, and others say to be a champion of the oppressed Jews of Prague. It worked its way into the book in a very small way. I didn't pay much attention, but quickly I realized that I felt like I was onto something. In the course of an interview with Will Eisner, the great comic artist, talking about the Jewish roots of comic books, if there were any, I asked him if he thought there were any. He's himself of Jewish origin, and he gave me a very kind of economic explanation that New York, and a demographic explanation that New York was very heavily Jewish at the time, and there were a lot of young men that liked to draw and wanted to make their living drawing, but all the really reputable ways of doing that were closed to Jews, so you couldn't get into advertising, you couldn't get into commercial art, you couldn't get into doing like magazine cover work, becoming the next Norman Rockwell or N.C. Wyeth was out of the question. What you could get into was comic books. They would take you. They were the bottom. And for that reason, if no other, that's why there were so many young Jewish guys in the comic book business. But then he paused and he said, but I've often wondered whether there wasn't something in the history of Jewish storytelling that didn't lend itself to the creation of Superman. For example, the Golem. And I had just started to really work the Golem into my book at that point, so it was very exciting for me to hear these words uttered by a man that I consider to be, a great sage, Will Eisner. What I've come to realize is in doing my research into golems, in the lore of golems, is that golems, one of the key features of golems is that they are a danger to their creator. Either in the process of creating a golem is itself dangerous and is only to be attempted by an adept, someone who's an expert in Kabbalah and and will not be harmed by the force of this amazingly complicated ritual, or the golem itself, once manufactured, is a danger to its creator. And in many stories, there's a very common motif of a golem who grows to an enormous height, and then when the rabbi who made him attempts to take the life out of it either by rubbing away the name of God from its forehead or the word truth from its forehead, or by removing a tablet from its mouth, the golem, it works. He tricks the golem into stooping down to have the word erased, but then immediately the golem is a lifeless hunk of clay that falls over on top of the rabbi and kills him. That idea of the danger of a golem to its creator has a lot of resonance for me. I have often felt endangered by my own work, not in any real sense. It's not like I've lived under a repressive regime until now that would put my life in danger. It's other kinds of danger, and it's a kind of danger that my father has encountered as a result of what I've written, and it has made me see that in many ways I am his golem. Whenever I write anything about fathers in any work of fiction, people assume I'm talking about my father. And he has suffered as a result of that. He's been embarrassed sometimes. Not all fathers in my fiction are especially admirable. And I guess finally this book is a kind of offering, an acknowledgement of the debt that I owe him for my creation, both as a person and as a writer. It's the debt of a golem to its creator, because neither it, the book, nor I could exist without him. Now, I was trying to think of something from this book that would be germane, that I could read, that would somehow illustrate or amplify what I've just been talking about, but I couldn't. So what I'm going to read to you is one of my favorite passages. It comes toward the end of the book, but I really don't think it's giving away anything. And if it is, I apologize. Joe Cavalier, one of the two main characters, has, in the course of his life in America, amasses a large collection of comic books. At first sort of by accident and then more deliberately. But a time comes when he's being forced out of his living quarters and he has to decide what to do with these 96 or 97 crates of comic books that he has amassed over the years. And Sammy Clay, his longtime partner, his best friend, and his co-creator in this great enterprise, of course, suggests the obvious solution, which is that he throw them away. That's what people did with comic books back then. They did not put them in Mylar protective sleeves and keep them in climate-controlled humidors the way they do now. So toss them, Sammy said. What's the big deal? Joe sighed. Although all the world, even Sammy Clay, who had spent most of his adult life making and selling them, viewed them as trash, Joe loved his comic books for their inferior color separation, their poorly trimmed paper stock, their ads for air rifles and dance courses and acne creams, for the basement smell that clung to the older ones, the ones that had been in storage during Joe's travels. Most of all, he loved them for the pictures and stories they contained, the inspirations and lucubrations of 500 aging boys dreaming as hard as they could for 15 years, transfiguring their insecurities and delusions, their wishes and their doubts, their public educations and their sexual perversions into something that only the most purblind of societies would have denied the status of art. Comic books had sustained his sanity. Having lost his mother, father, brother, and grandfather, the friends and foes of his youth, his beloved teacher, Bernard Kornblum, his city, his history, his home, the usual charge leveled against comic books, that they offered merely an easy escape from reality, seemed to Joe actually to be a powerful argument on their behalf. He had escaped in his life from ropes, chains, boxes, bags, and crates, from handcuffs and shackles, from countries and regimes, from the arms of a woman who loved him, from crashed airplanes and an opiate addiction, and from an entire frozen continent intent on causing his death. No, but I don't give anything away, so. The escape from reality was, he felt, especially right after the war, a worthy challenge. He would remember for the rest of his life a peaceful half-hour spent reading a copy of Betty and Veronica that he had found in a service station restroom, lying down with it under a fir tree in a sun-slanting forest outside of Medford, Oregon, wholly absorbed into that primary colored world of bad gags, heavy ink lines, Shakespearean farce, and the deep, almost oriental mystery of the two big-toothed, wasp-waisted goddess girls, light and dark, entangled forever in the enmity of their friendship. The pain of his loss, though he would never have spoken of it in these terms, was always with him in those days, a cold, smooth ball lodged in his chest, just behind his sternum. For that half hour spent in the dappled shade of the Douglas firs, reading Betty and Veronica, the icy ball had melted away without him even noticing. That was magic. Not the apparent magic of the silk-hatted card palmer, or the bold, brute trickery of the escape artist, but the genuine magic of art. It was a mark of how fucked up and broken was the world, the reality that had swallowed his home and his family, that such a feat of escape, by no means easy to pull off, should remain so universally despised. That's all. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, is this on? Yes, it is. Michael took, of course, away some of my questions, so we'll probably fall completely silent after a few ones, and then you can take over with questions to Michael.
Absolutely.
To begin with an easy one, or perhaps not such an easy one, I called you the boy wonder of American literature.
Thank you for that, too.
No thanks. Referring, of course, I mean, in Holland, this character from the cartoon is actually, and the TV series is called Robin. So this Dutchman. He's also called Robin in America, of course, but we don't know him as the boy wonder.
Oh, I see.
He's
also called Dick.
If you could, yes, we come to that. Actually.
Okay,
we come to that. Those questions you didn't take away. If you really could choose which comic character you could be, which one would it be? Would you? Which powers would you want to have?
Oh, that's a very good question. I've never really thought about that. I think I'd like to be one of the secretly handicapped superheroes who acquires his power because of his handicap. I always admired those the most. There's a Marvel superhero called Daredevil who's blind. He's blinded in an accident where he's hit by a truck full of uranium or radium or something, and magically he acquires some extrasensory kinds of powers that compensate for his blindness. But I always liked those heroes, the ones that weren't absolutely superpowered like Superman and could make time go backward and so on. That was too much power, I think.
Did you like Superman?
Yeah, I love Superman.
You loved everything, probably.
I was quite expert in Superman at one time.
I was listening to you when you were talking about your father who gave you comics, and more or less about the status of comics in American culture.
Mm-hmm.
In Dutch culture, I think, comics are a bit looked down upon.
They are?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
they're not really
I thought Europe
they're
had a
not
much more
really-
enlightened attitude toward comics than
Well, to some
America.
comics, I think. I mean, comics in Europe should be intellectual,
Uh-huh.
like the famous Asterix or Lucky Luke comics we
Lucky
have.
Luke is very intellectual.
Very. Oh, you don't know how intellectual they are.
I do.
But have you encountered that in America the status of comics are higher than in Europe?
No, I don't
Does
think
it
that's
surprise
true.
you?
No. I mean, comics really are still fighting for recognition, even though in recent years comics have produced works like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, Ben Catcher's Julius Knipple, real estate photographer.
Joe Sacco.
Yeah, Joe Sacco, Chris Ware, Dan Clowes. I mean, there have been some great works of fiction, or whatever you would want to call them, produced by great novels produced by comic artists. Nevertheless, the average reader of fiction, somebody who loves fiction, reads a lot of it. If you said, hey, would you like to read this Dan Clowes comic book, would say, are you kidding? I don't read comic books. So I think the battle is far from won.
But at least your father had no prejudice.
No,
against-
absolutely not. I
against
mean,
these comic books.
he loved them. He read them. He would typically pick them up on his way home from work on Friday afternoon, and he would read them all before he gave them to me. So,
Well, is this on? Yes, it is. Michael took, of course, away some of my questions, so we'll probably fall completely silent after a few ones, and then you can take over with questions to Michael.
absolutely.
To begin with an easy one, or perhaps not such an easy one, I called you the boy wonder of American literature.
Thank you for that too.
No thanks. Referring, of course,
To my
I mean,
tights.
in Holland, this character from the cartoon is actually, and the TV series is called Robin. So this for the
Right.
Dutchman. He's also called Robin
Yeah.
in America, of course, but we don't know him as the boy wonder.
Oh, I see. He's also called Dick.
If you could, yes, we come to that. Actually.
Okay.
We come to that. Those questions you didn't take away. If you really could choose which comic character you could be, which one would it be? Would you, I mean, which powers would you want to have?
Oh, that's a very good question. I've never really thought about that. I think I'd like to be one of the secretly handicapped superheroes who
Tell us about
acquires
it.
his power because of his handicap. I always admired those the most. There's a Marvel superhero called Daredevil who's blind. He's blinded in an accident where he's hit by a truck full of uranium or radium or something, and magically he acquires some extrasensory kinds of powers that compensate for his blindness. But I always liked those heroes, the ones that weren't absolutely superpowered like Superman and could make time go backward and so on. That was too much power, I think.
Did you like Superman?
Yeah,
Or-
yes, yeah, I love Superman.
You loved everything,
Well, I love
probably.
I was quite expert in Superman at one time.
I was listening to you and you were talking about your father who gave you comics and, well, more or less about the status of comics in American culture.
Mm-hmm.
In Dutch culture, I think, well, comics are a bit looked down upon.
They are?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
they're not really...
I thought Europe
They're
had a
not
much more
really-
enlightened attitude toward comics than
Well, to some
America.
comics, I think. I mean, comics in Europe should be intellectual,
Uh-huh.
like the famous Asterix or Lucky Luke comics
Lucky
we have.
Luke is very intellectual.
Very. Oh, you don't know how intellectual they are.
I do.
But have you encountered that in America the status of comics are higher than in Europe?
No, I don't
Does
think
it
that's true.
surprise you?
No. I mean, comics really are still fighting for recognition, even though in recent years comics have produced works like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, Ben Catcher's Julius Knipple, real estate photographer.
Joe Sacco.
Yeah, Joe Sacco, Chris Ware, Dan Clowes. I mean, there have been some great works of fiction, or whatever you would want to call them, great novels produced by comic artists. Nevertheless, the average reader of fiction, somebody who loves fiction, reads a lot of it. If you said, hey, would you like to read this Dan Clowes comic book, would say, are you kidding? I don't read comic books. So I think the battle is far from won.
But at least your father had no prejudice.
No,
against,
absolutely not. I mean,
these comic books.
he loved them. He read them. He would typically pick them up on his way home from work on Friday afternoon, and he would read them all before he gave them to me. So, but he was very neat, so I didn't mind. He kept everything, you know. He read them very carefully. But no, I mean, my father was a sort of early adopter or an early embracer of pop culture. I think, you know. The pop art movement of the 1960s really seemed old hat to him. And I don't think, you know, comics were, to him, a necessary part of childhood, I think. Mm-hmm. And I feel pretty much the same way about them with regard to my own children, although comics have changed a lot since then. And it's hard to find comics now that I think are appropriate for small children. They tend to be very violent and
well, that's what most
that's
parents thought in the 60s,
yes.
probably.
No, well, that's true, but
that.
No guts and you know, there was no actual bloodshed, and especially in the world of DC Comics, all through up until the mid to late 70s were pristine, very innocent. The world of Superman remained very almost retrograde in a lot of ways, although Lois Lane finally, you know, got a little bit of a life of her own in some ways, but. No, I mean, comics are different now than they were. They're not aimed. They used to be aimed at children. Now they're aimed at teenagers.
Mm-hmm. Well, we come to the dangerous subjects of even these comics.
Okay.
But first, I want to ask something about. Well, The Adventure of Cavalier and Clay is very much a novel about the old and the new world. There's Europe, in which the first part of the book takes place, Prague. And then there's, of course, New York, and there are other places like Antarctica and where the story goes. But it's basically between the old and the new world. You told us, I think, a little bit, or sort of on the sly, about your own descent or your European roots, so to speak. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Do you have roots in, for example, Czechia, the Czech Republic?
No, I don't. My family on my mother's side were mostly from Lithuania, in the area in and around Vilnius, and my father's family were from various parts of what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, sort of Poland, Russia, Austria, Galicia, that area, Lvov or Lemberg, places like that.
So what brought you to Prague was the Golem?
No, I went to Prague on a vacation. And I was traveling I went to Budapest on the same trip and just was very struck by Prague. It made a deep impression on me out of no direct personal connection to it, but I did feel very connected to the traces of the Jewish life of Prague that are still there and are, you know, very well preserved, and in fact are probably the main tourist attraction, or one of them, of the city. The irony of that, the irony of a city sort of selling T-shirts and mugs with the image of the Golem and Kafka, you know, two products of this world that is completely gone, was not lost on me. I was very moved by my visit there, and I never forgot it. And when I was looking around for a place to have Joe be from, at that point I had not been to Vilnius. I have since. I've never been to Lvov, so I needed a Central European place that he could be from, that is someplace I had some experience of, so I just chose Prague. The Golem, as I said, worked its way into the book very much by surprise and without my expecting it. But it was kind of an inevitable result of that decision to write about Prague.
Yes. Yeah. And was this vacation the only research you did for the part that plays in Prague?
No, I didn't go back, but I did a lot of reading. I read memoirs. A lot of people who were part of the Jewish community in the 30s wrote memoirs subsequently about their experiences. I was able to find a lot of those. I read, books about Prague. I read Biography of Kafka, just to get a sense of Prague of 10 or 15 years earlier, the German Jewish world of Prague in the 20s and 30s that Joseph would have come out of, having been born in 1921. Yeah, I was mostly reading.
And did you do the same kind of research for New York, which for you probably was also a strange town since you were raised in, well, on the East Coast.
Yeah,
But far
I do
from.
have family ties to New York. My family all came to New York first and stayed in New York for relative lengths of time. That's why my father was born there, and you know, I'd spent a lot of time in New York, but I didn't know it intimately. I didn't know it as well as I felt I needed to know it, and I especially didn't know it in terms of what it had been like in the 30s and 40s. I had a strong feeling about what it had been like because of my father, and because of all the subsequent reading I had done and the interest I took. And you know, whenever you see a movie that was made in the 30s or 40s that's set in New York, of course it was filmed in Hollywood, but they have this incredible stock footage they would include of shots of Times Square at night and you know, people walking through Union Square or whatever. And whenever at those moments, they're these tantalizing glimpses, because usually it's an establishing shot. It only lasts a few seconds. You know, I would always just stare at that image to try to, I'm talking about before I ever started writing this book, just to see what it was like, that amazing moment of looking through a window into the past, always so tantalizingly brief. I went to New York and spent a month there, and I had the 1939 WPA guide to New York City. The Works Progress Administration under the Roosevelt administration produced a series of travel guides, tour books for a lot of major regions or cities of the United States. And the
Commercial tourist
yeah, they were
books?
sold. They're beautiful books. It was a way to give writers work. It was just like they had mural projects for painters, and they had folk song collecting projects for musicians, and this was a way to give writers work to produce these guidebooks. And the writers who worked on the New York City book included a young John Cheever and a young Richard Wright. So this is beautifully written. There's this one, the section on Coney Island is just pure Cheever. I mean, nothing is signed, so you have to guess at who wrote what, but the Coney Island, it reads like a little miniature John Cheever story.
Is it still printed?
No, it was reprinted. It was reprinted in the late 70s, early 80s, and some of the other ones were reprinted at that time too, but it's out of print again as far as I know. I bought one in a used bookstore that was an original from '39, and I just took this tour book and walked around New York and saw what was there that was also there, and I learned a lot that way.
Was there still a lot the same in New
Yeah,
York?
there was a surprising amount that was still there.
New York was never bombed, of course.
Right,
I mean,
right.
We don't have that luxury in
No,
Europe, I think.
not by artillery anyway.
Those were the two of those were two locations of your book, and then there is, of course, the third. There is a chilling chapter in the book, which takes place, or chapter, it's more chapters, but part of the book, which takes place in Antarctica, among the ice, in the polar winter. Did you do any research for
Lots.
that? Did you
Lots.
go to Antarctica?
No, I did not go to Antarctica. I would love to go, but there's a part of me that resists the idea of going. I could have gone, and I debated going, but I don't know. There's something about the tourism to Antarctica that offends my sensibilities. It seems like it only should be visited by people with dog sleds and
people like you, of course.
yes, well, I can go in my imagination. I mean, that's ultimately what I decided to do, because I felt from reading that I could do it, that I had a good sense of the place to try to accurately convey what it would be like to be there. But I also knew that I was really creating a kind of literary Antarctica, and I had some antecedents there in Edgar Allan Poe and his narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, and in H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, these two literary Antarcticas that both created by men who never left the continental United States, let alone go to Antarctica. And I thought if Poe can do it and Lovecraft could do it, then I could do it too. So that's how I looked at it. It was that was the most fun part of the book for me. What I did was I just went to a university library and I got a pile of books about this tall of records of Antarctic exploration, all of it pre-1939, because I didn't want to be tainted by later epochs of Antarctic exploration. And I just read them, consumed them one after another without a break, without writing anything, until I was just completely steeped in the lore of Antarctica and the ways of exploration and all the terminology, and all of it was just seething. And then I just sat down, and in 5 days I wrote that whole 50-page section, and I didn't rewrite it. I tinkered with it a tiny bit. I just left it. It just came out in this incredible burst. And I've never really had an experience like that. Where I felt I was there, I really did. And that's how I knew I was okay.
Well, that's the feeling you get as a reader, actually, that you are there. So it's also
Oh,
sort of
good. I'm glad.
literary tourism you get. In the novel, there are two main characters. One is Joe, about whom we have heard. He's the one from Prague, and the other one is Sammy, and he suffers from being a homosexual in a time when homosexuals were discriminated against, were not tolerated. This is an important thing in the completely unlike now, we must say. My question would be, did you make one of your characters homosexual? Because that fits in
No, his mother did.
So some people say. Well, did you make his mother make him? Because it fits in nicely with the theories, also in the book, by the way, of people who were saying, well, there are dangerous homosexual subtexts to many of these Marvel comics in which you have Batman, who's the ward of this boy wonder, and they're all, well, sort of thinking about the special relationship those two have.
Yeah, sitting around in smoking jackets, lounging around the mansion.
Yes.
Saying,
and together in the car,
what do you want to do
course.
tonight, Dick? And that's, yeah. No, I mean, yes. I spent the first 45, 50 pages of writing this book just trying to get to know my two characters and what they were like, and they came to me fairly easily, and I got to know them fairly quickly, which, was a good sign, which is something that never happened. I should point out when I was writing that book that I abandoned, I never felt like I knew the characters. I think that was part of the problem. I kept trying to guess. Sammy and Joe came to me quite easily, and there's a moment fairly early in the story where they get locked out of an apartment, and Joe, they need to get in. It's a desperate thing. They have to get to work on this comic book, and all the tools and everything they need are in this apartment. So Joe goes up the fire escape, and he does it in this very dashing way, with a little more dashing than he really needs to be, and goes up and flies through the window of the apartment, and there's this little female voice that screams, this sort of like movie scream. And at that moment, I was doing it from the point of view of Sammy, watching this happen, and asking myself, well, what's he thinking as he sees this? What's he feeling as he sees this? And it just emerged at that moment that he was feeling a kind of attraction to his cousin, admiration mingled with a desire to, not the kind of desire that's necessarily a sexual desire, but a desire not to have his cousin, as it says in the book, but to be him. Mm-hmm. That Sammy had polio as a child. He has bad legs. He's not nimble. He can't get around very easily. And just to see this very beautiful young man just go up this fire escape and into the window, that was the moment where I realized what Sammy was like. And it just immediately occurred to me that's going to be very interesting because he's living in this time where it's very restricted. He's going to have to hide his identity. I wonder what that's like, And then I thought of Superman and Batman and all these superheroes that hide their identities, that have these secret lives where they put on funny costumes that include tights, and they run around and with the gloves on and punching people, and right away, it's an instantaneous connection. I'm like, of course, he has a secret identity. Mm-hmm. He's a member of this Justice League of America that keeps its headquarters a secret, and I knew that I was going to be dealing with this material you alluded to with the Frederick Wortham book, The Seduction of the Innocent, that condemned comics for their pernicious effects on America's youth, and these Senate subcommittee hearings that condemned comic books, and there was a strong component in that condemnation of anti-homosexual propaganda, that's comic books that were claimed to be this veiled propaganda, just like communist propaganda for recruiting, new members. Because I knew that was 15 years down the road in terms of my book, I thought, well, of course, then I have to have a character who's gay, who's that's going to be a direct challenge to him personally. Mm-hmm. And there's this embarrassing fact that gets unearthed about Sammy late in the book, which is that in the course of his career working in comics, wherever he goes, he typically is assigned to take over a failed character, a character that the sales are flat. And the first thing he does is give that character a kid sidekick. And this is used against him as evidence of his, proclivities,
Yes.
that he has these strange tendencies. And, I think that it all just grew out of this one moment of trying to get what he was feeling.
The relationship between Joe and Sammy is very well played out in the book, and that is something. Male relationships is something that is very, very strong in your books.
Mm-hmm.
In your first novel, in the Mysteries of Pittsburgh, it's very important, the homosexual relationship. In
And the
Wonder
father-son.
Boys, it's. I mean, you have Grady Tripp, who is a sort of, he's the protagonist of Wonder Boys, the book that was made into a film. And he's a womanizer, and there are lots of women around him, but what you remember once you have read the book is more his relation to his editor, or his relation to the young guy they meet.
Right.
Would you say that is one of the big themes in your work?
Yeah,
Male
definitely.
relationships?
Absolutely. It just seems to keep recurring. And, I think there are a lot of possible explanations for that, but ultimately it just boils down to an unconscious choice that I make when I'm trying to put a story together that, I don't know that much about women's relationships with women. I know a little bit, and I might be able to pull it off, but it would be work in a way that I don't want my writing to be work. As far as women's relationships with men, I know plenty about that, but what can you say? It's all been said. Going back to the Song of Solomon in the Bible. But men's relationships with other men.
Well, then you go back to David and
Yes,
Saul in the Bible.
Yes, David and Saul in the Bible. I don't know. There's something about it that feels unexamined to me still, or especially in a context of contemporary American life, which this book doesn't really address. But I think that the literary. No, I don't even want to say that. I just think that the discussion of men's feelings about other men is a very impoverished discussion in the United States. The terminology is very limited. The discussions tend to be very short and embarrassed. But, we have these very limited categories of men can be buddies, or men can be lovers, and there's nothing else
In between.
In between. I think that's, clearly preposterous. I think men's feelings tend to fall all along that spectrum between buddies and lovers. I don't know. I think any kind of unexamined region, unexplored region, a region that doesn't have language devoted to it, is calling out for a writer to come along and write about it and try to describe it.
But it's interesting that you say that, because if you look to the tradition of American literature, then it's all the
That's
great
true.
classics are. Almost every classic is about a male
that's 'cause they were-
relationship. I mean,
those
you got
classics were chosen by men. The list of classics was drawn up by a bunch
well,
of
it
guys.
can't be that easy. I mean, you got Huckleberry Finn and Jim. You got Ishmael and Queequeg.
right.
You got the whole Hemingway, Poe,
right,
everyone. They were
right.
all male relationships,
Right.
and you say that it hasn't been explored enough.
In
I would say
contemporary
that in American
terms.
literature, the male-female relationship isn't explored enough.
It may
Or
be
in
his-
romantic fiction, perhaps, but in serious literary fiction.
Maybe historically that's true. But what I see looking around are, if you look back, let's look at the 19th century and the way that men discuss their feelings about each other. Friends, men who are friends, lifelong friends, would write letters to each other that read like love letters today, that are passionate, full of these passionate declarations. The physical display of affection was completely, I don't know what it's like in Holland and other countries of the world. It's still very much, part of being friends is for men to walk arm in arm or put their arms around each other. Completely impossible in America. Off limits, immediately would label you as being gay. That's incredibly tragic, and I think that impoverishment is all on the surface, and underneath is this big reservoir of emotion and feeling that's just not being examined or explored. And that's why I think in part I'm interested in writing about it.
Well, let's talk about completely different
Okay.
subjects. Simple question. I think the success of Wonder Boys, the film, was in second instance, because the first time it hardly got noticed, nobody went to it, the critics were very enthusiastic about it, but then it sort of attracted more
Well,
people in the
The
second
first time it hardly got noticed, and the second time it was a little better, it barely got noticed.
Well, that sort of answered my question, because I wanted to ask whether your life was changed more about the filming of Wonder Boys or about the winning of the Pulitzer
Well,
Prize.
It was a 1-2 punch. The film finally, before the movie was made, when I told people I was a writer, they would say, "Oh, that's nice. What do you write?" And I'd name my books, and they'd say, I haven't heard of them. And then we would move on to something else to talk about. When the movie came out, then I could say Wonder Boys, and they'd say, "Oh," and I'd say, "It was made into a movie," and they'd say, "Oh, I didn't see it, but a movie, who was in it?"
Michael
And I'd say,
Douglas.
Michael Douglas. And they'd say, either I love Michael Douglas or I hate Michael Douglas, or, "Oh, no, I did see that movie," or "I heard about it," and suddenly,
So the movie
was a kind
gave
of
you a
interest there.
conversation piece.
Yes.
And what did the Pulitzer Prize give you?
The Pulitzer Prize has meant that I think that I'm much more recognized now for actually having written a book than for simply having had a movie made out of one of my books. And
So it's sort of...
because I can't take credit. I mean, I thought the movie was a good movie, but I can't really take credit for it. I had nothing to do with it. I mean, I know people say, "Oh, you wrote the book, blah, blah, blah," but the honest truth is I had nothing to do with it. The screenplay was an adaptation completely generated from the mind of the screenwriter. He did a very good job. Then it was filmed by somebody, directed by somebody, starring all these other people. I really can't take credit for it. So it was always this awkward moment of like, "Oh, that was a great movie." And I say, "Well, thank you." But
Well, at least it was...
it was like being praised for my nephew and not my son. It's like I can't, he is a nice nephew, but I had nothing to do with it.
Okay, well, let's talk about something
The
you have...
Pulitzer was being praised for my son, my child, my daughter, whatever you want to call it. It was a child of mine, and I felt like I could actually say, "Well, thank you. I had a lot to do with that one."
You are involved at the moment with the making of the film of The Adventures of Kavalier Clay.
Yeah. So I can take the blame.
Yeah, you can take the blame. But does that change? Is it changing your writing, or is it because a lot of writers get distracted when they write for film? I mean, if I think of the film Barton Fink, in which a writer is going to Hollywood and completely unraveling,
Yeah.
I always think when I hear a writer who's involved with films, I think, oh, take care.
Well, fortunately, they haven't put me on a wrestling picture yet. But I think actually Barton Fink is a very instructive example of how to survive writing in Hollywood. What happens to Barton Fink? The big problem for Barton Fink is that he cares.
Yes.
He comes to Hollywood.
He wants to make a good
he's gonna
movie. Yeah.
Write this, what he thinks is a good movie that's going to have this strong social message, and it's going to really change people's minds. And it's because he has such high hopes and expectations that he's destroyed. But I have no such expectations. I don't even think a movie's going to be made. I mean, that is a safe bet. Most movies don't get made. So you could write the screenplay, and you're one of 500 screenplays that are under consideration that year that get to a certain point, and of those 500, even some of them get cast or have a director hired and all of that, and then they still fall apart, or they go south, or they don't get made, or the executive gets fired, and all of his projects are canceled. And I just have an expectation of only one expectation, and that's getting paid.
Oh.
And the pay is very generous, and it helps finance the writing of novels, and I don't really expect anything out of it. So
Well, that's a bit
hopefully
like one of the characters in The Amazing Adventures says. He says something like,
yes.
you
There's
have
only
to
one
keep
way.
one thing in mind. Well, you say it yourself, because I can't
There's
quote
only
literally.
one way to ensure happiness, and that is to always to make sure that you're only doing it for the money. But I don't agree with that statement. Only with regard to Hollywood do I agree with that statement. In other things, I think there are other much more important factors. But if you let them get your hopes up, if you start listening to them when they say things like, "It's going to be great, and we're going to do this, and we're going to have, Brad Pitt is going to be in it," and when you start listening, that's when they have you. So I don't listen.
So how many drafts have you written?
I'm on the third now. And they're calling to say, I just found out from my wife, they're calling to say, "What is he doing in Holland? He's supposed to be writing."
Research. It's like Antarctica.
Yes.
I think it would be a good moment to throw it open to the floor if there are any people who want to ask a question to Michael
Is this microphone
Chabon.
here so that people can step up to it?
I think it is. Yes. And there's probably even a microphone
Or if you'd like to sing
in the
a
back
song.
of the.
Is there somebody back there raising?
Yes.
Yes.
Could
Sure.
you come to the mic?
Okay, well, actually, I first had a very brief remark, is you kind of freaked me out with your introduction because you stated that the first thing you ever wrote about was Arthur Conan Doyle. And before I kind of committed to becoming a story writer, I took a course in portraiture, and the first grid portrait I did was of Arthur Conan Doyle.
Wow.
And since both of our families are from Lvov, I'm now going to have to search almanacs for meteors. But actually, what I was kind of interested in is you were talking about the continuity of comics in your life as they were passed on from your grandfather, the printer, to your father, who read them avidly. But I remember a number of years ago in an interview in the New York Times, you stated that you were actually developing a comic of your own with your son.
Yeah.
I believe the Ebony Butterfly.
Black Butterfly.
Black Butterfly, that
Yes.
was it. And I was just curious, are you still working on that? Is that something you're actually still kind of...
My son has lost
using-
interest in the Black Butterfly. He's moved on, and his name is Ezekiel, so his nickname is Zeke. And so the letter Z is very important to him. And he recently discovered the X-Men, the Marvel comic, the X-Men, so he's come up with the Z-Men. And they
Wasn't that Zorro?
Well, so he likes Zorro. He thinks Zorro's pretty cool, too.
Yeah, he's
But
cool.
there's Z-Clops and the Zebra, the Zipper, Racer Z, and the Flying Z. And they all have their powers and costumes, and that's his latest creation.
So the alphabet has led to the downfall of the Black Butterfly?
Yes, the Black Butterfly is... I don't know what's become of the Black Butterfly.
Okay, well,
Well,
Thank you for asking.
informative.
if I could get in here, you told me you were writing a children's book, which is a completely different thing from a big 700-page novel.
Yes and no.
Could you tell us a bit about that?
I mean, I don't really... I'm honestly not very aware of any real difference in the act of writing when I'm sitting, excuse me, typing. It feels the same, and the language feels like it's coming from the very same place. The story feels like it's coming wherever that place is. The story feels like it's coming from the very same place. I feel like I'm just writing a book. I am trying to keep my language a little simpler, to use more familiar words. If I have a choice between a more familiar and a less familiar word, I would choose the more familiar word. Often when I'm writing for adults, I'll choose the less familiar, as long as it's familiar to me, and keeping the sentences shorter. And I use Microsoft Word, the word processing program, and it's very helpfully always, because I could turn it off, but I never do. It's always flagging my sentences, saying too long, too long. It gets this wiggly green, like mold is growing under your sentence. It's so long, and as soon as that happens now, and I look at the sentence and I say, okay, is this sentence too long? Maybe I should stop it or find a way to break it into 2 parts or something like that.
So Microsoft is a great help
Yes.
in writing a children's book.
I heartily endorse Microsoft Word. It's a great program. So other than that, and there's a certain conscious mind at work keeping those word choices simpler or keeping the sentences shorter. But other than that, I'm not really aware of any real difference. I'm just telling a story. It happens to be a story about fairies, but and I'm sure adult audiences would turn up their noses at that, and hopefully children won't. We'll see.
Okay.
Fairies, not like...
No, I understand. No, because not such a big step then.
No, yes, exactly.
There's another one.
Yes, well, first of all,
Could you
thank
move closer to the mic?
Oh, first of all, thank you. I like your work.
Thank you.
I'd like to know if your father is also a writer.
No, he's a doctor.
He's a doctor.
Yeah, and a lawyer.
Oh, boy.
And an Indian chief.
Well,
And the policeman?
something which a little bit bothered me was this, that it was always father, son, very male-oriented thing. why didn't you ever mention your mom?
My mother, because I love her too much to embarrass her in public in this way.
Well then.
Well, because this book really is my father's. It really grew out of his world. And my mother's world was a very different world. In her childhood, while I feel that I know probably quite as much about it as I do of my father's, it doesn't really get reflected in this book in any ways that I'm aware of. That may happen someday. My mother is a very normal, quiet, unassuming person who does not make her presence known. And
She was
my
pushed.
dad, by contrast, is a very big
Like
person,
my mom.
physically as well as in his personality. So it's maybe just that it's easier to write about stuff coming from him than it is.
No, that wasn't a criticism. I just was wondering.
Yeah, no.
Okay, well, thank you.
I think my mother, to be honest, is very relieved that I have not. She's counting her blessings.
Are there any other questions?
When my father used to, there was a run there of stories that I wrote that had fathers, and some of them were based on him and some of them weren't, but he was continually getting embarrassed in public by people. And so then after a while there, I would get these tense questions from him on the phone. He'd say, "So, what are you writing?" And I would always say, "Oh, I'm writing a novel about a transvestite doctor." Yes.
I have a very simple question. How long did it take you to write this book?
4 years, 4 months, and 4 days.
Thank you.
But who's counting?
I think my voice projects loud enough.
It does.
I just wanted to ask, I've been reading your books since the Mystery of Pittsburgh, I think, for about 7 years now. I've read Kavalier Clay most recently, and I love it. It's
Thank you.
very intricate details. You just answered the question, how long did it take to write? How much of that was actually spent in research?
Well, it's hard to say. I did some research before I got going, mostly about New York, reading about New York and reading about the history of comic books. And then I started writing. And as I wrote, things came up that I realized I needed to inform myself about. From escape artistry and Houdini to the Antarctic, the Empire State Building, which plays a key role in this book. All kinds of things would arise, and I would have to go off to the library and do more research. Altogether, if you include the month I spent living in New York, I probably spent a couple of months doing research, but it was scattered over the course of writing the book. And I would save up things. I would come upon something that I couldn't find out, but it wasn't big enough for me to warrant a trip to the library, so I would keep a list, and then I would go to the library with 5 or 6 things that I needed to check into. I should also say the World Wide Web was an incredible, constant resource for me. It's invaluable. I can't imagine how I ever got along without it. And the people raise questions about how reliable the information you find on the web is, but if you're an experienced web browser, you get a sense. You can, after a while, you learn what kind of sources you can rely on and what kind you can't. You can cross-check and so on. And I would find the most bizarre, obscure details, like the name of the tenor in the ink spots. How could I go to a library and find that out? You can't look up ink spots in the card catalog. You'd have to look up great music of the 30s and 40s, try to find a book like that, hope there was a section on the ink spots. It'd probably be checked out or stolen. But there it was. I typed in ink spots and tenor into Google.
And you got it.
And I got it because there's a fan page of the ink spots, and it's got detailed biographies of every member of the ink spots and what they had for breakfast, and so it was for stuff like that. Or there were amazing, miraculous discoveries. I should say there was a great Houdini website that had footage of him I could look at, old movie footage, and the sound of him talking, and things that I just were, I don't know how exactly helped me in the book, but it was interesting. And but I was writing. My dad always talked about the fact that there was a Brooklyn Dodgers football team at one time in the NFL, and so I'd always been intrigued by that idea. And I alluded to Sammy going
to the Brooklyn Dodgers football games. It seemed to me that Sammy might be interested in football. And then I thought, well, I'll just look and see what I can find about it. And I had actually written something like he had a crush on the quarterback, or something like that. He took an unusual interest in the quarterback of the Brooklyn Dodgers football team. Then I did a Google search, and I found out that in this period, the Brooklyn Dodgers had a great quarterback who was a big star and was handsome, and his name was Ace Parker. You know, it was just that kind of thing, these amazing magical discoveries. It really is like the Borgesian kind of library of Babel.
Your first two novels were very close to your own world. So does it mean that the World Wide Web made it possible for you to go further into the world, as it were?
Yeah, I think you could say that. When it came to things like Antarctica, I was able to find all kinds of things on the web, live resources of people who are there right now and are reporting things about Antarctica. I could actually, in a sense, converse with them. I probably could have emailed them if I had chosen to. Yes, definitely. I feel that it does expand my reach in terms of information and even inspiration, because I would find things by accident that would suddenly click in my mind, and I say, there is a way out of a problem that I've been having that I would have not encountered if I hadn't stumbled on this particular website. I very much incorporated it into my practice, but it's dangerous and it's seductive, and you can get caught in the web and stay there for far too long. And in fact, if I seem to go through phases where it's worse than others. But what I've taken to doing is taking my laptop and sitting on I have a little couch in my office, and I sit on the couch with my laptop, and that way the web connection is sufficiently far away that I have to get up and go over there. It seems to work as an effective. I only get up if I really need to, because I'm very lazy. Anyone else? Yes? Oh, okay, here, and then.
Yes.
Is it possible to write two things, one short story and working on a book?
At the same time?
Yeah.
With one hand and one hand? No, yes, I take breaks often when I'm working on a novel to write a short story or something else, a short piece for a magazine or something like that. It's often nice to get away, take a vacation, and come back feeling refreshed and that you've got a different perspective on what you were doing. So I often write stories. And right now I'm working on the screenplay. I'm working on that, and typically I'm a night writer. I write at night, and I'm working on my children's novel, Summerland, at night, but I'm working on the screenplay during the day. So I'm actually working on two projects at once. But writing a screenplay is not like writing, really. It's more like puzzle solving. So it's taking up a different part of my mind. It doesn't really intrude. Yes?
In The Wonder Boys, it seemed that there was some kind of link, autobiographical link to the piece that you were working on, like 1,500 pages, I believe. You've taken something so far afield. At what point does one come to that conclusion? How do you keep yourself sort of in the story or on track?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't know if there's any good way of knowing it. Should I repeat the question? Did everyone hear it? Okay. I had suspicions within the first year or so of working on that other book that it wasn't going right. It didn't feel right. And I kept at it mostly because I had signed a contract for it and I had been paid some of the money for it up front. And I didn't relish the thought of having to give the money back, mostly because I had spent it. I was afraid, I just didn't like the implications of that. It felt very scary, the idea of sort of defaulting in that way on a promise I had made. So I stuck with it for much longer than I ought to have, knowing almost the whole time that it wasn't working, although I did fool myself from time to time into thinking that it was. But then again, when I was working on this book, I had moments where I was lost and doubtful and uncertain about where I was going or if I could do it. And I kept going, and it worked out. I think I never doubted when writing this book that I was writing about things that were worth writing about, that there was real stuff here. Things just kept emerging from the material and connecting up to all the other things. So the Golem somehow was connecting to the escape artistry, which was connecting to comic books, which was connecting to life in suburban Long Island in the 1950s. And the way things kept interlocking with each other, I always took as a reassurance that what I was writing about was real and was worth writing about. And that didn't happen so much with that other book. I always felt like I was just sort of smushing things together and hoping they would stick. And it was like using old clay. You smush it together and then you let go and it all just goes. It didn't stick together. And, so I suppose you have to try to trust your instincts, but I say that in full awareness that sometimes your instincts are confused and it's hard to know what to do. But the best solution in my mind for all problems of writing, I'm not saying it works every time, but it's the only one that works most of the time, is just to keep working and to have a regular schedule and to write at the same time every day, day in and day out, without giving yourself the excuse of not writing, without ever letting yourself take a vacation when you're in the middle of a project, unless I guess it's to write something else. That habit, that force of habit, I think is the best hedge against getting lost in that way, because even if you just keep working, you can write your way out of it, I think, a lot of times. But if you stop, then you're doomed. What's the word I'm looking for? We're baseless. I substituted Wonder Boys, and everybody said great. And so, they'd been, my editor and my agent had been through 3 or 4 drafts of that book, and actually, I kept it a secret when I started, when I switched, when I dumped Fountain City finally, and I use that verb dumped, and it makes it sound like it was the easiest thing in the world, but it was a really painful decision for me. And when I abandoned it and started working on what became Wonder Boys, I didn't tell anybody. I kept it a secret from my wife for 6 weeks, and then when I told her, I didn't tell anybody else. And then with great apprehension, having finished the first draft, I called my agent up and I said, I have some good news and some strange news. And she said, okay. And I said, the good news is I finished my book. And she said, great. Because here was going to come draft number 4 or 5 or whatever of this monster. And then I said, but it's not, the strange news is it's not the same book. And she said, great! So I don't think there were a lot of tears shed when I substituted Wonder Boys.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Pieter, for holding the interview, which was very good. And thank you so much for your story and for your talk. I'm amazed you connected to so many figures and dazzling. And also your website itself. I mean, you haven't talked about your own website, but it's so creative. And if you see what you do on the web, it's unbelievable. So,
www.michaelchabon.com.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Well, as I told you before, Michael Chabon will be signing books a little bit in the way you walked in, and then the bar, you hit the bar, you can have a drink and maybe let your book signed. But before you walk out and go to the bar, I would like to draw your attention to the John Adams Institute. And please, if you walk out, you hit the information stand and pick up a brochure if you don't have one yet. I think they were all on the chairs, but anyway, you can fill it in a form if you're not a donor or a sponsor yet. Because we are an independent and a non-profit institute, and we cannot do these wonderful things without your help and without sponsors. So it would be nice if you could do something for us. One more thing before I let you go. is to tell you that our next lecture is also here in the West India House on the 26th of September of this month with American author David Sedaris. And he will be interviewed by your colleague, Pieter, Tracy Metz. So I would like to invite you all and come in 3 weeks' time back on a Wednesday night here in the West Indies House. Thank you so much.